Our next speaker is lecturer Tinashe Khondo from the Faculty of Law. Welcome, sir. Are you there?
Thank you, Juliet. How are you?
Okay, and you. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us and for all your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Today I'm going to be presenting on my reflections upon my two courses for the first semester, which are Competition Law 431 and the Law of Insolvency, where I use different testing options for students to be able to reflect and engage critically with the work. Can we move on to the next slide? So basically, we found ourselves in an unfamiliar territory where we had to teach from home and be able to engage with our students. Unfortunately, given the differences in the courses that we teach, so for example, the Law of Insolvency has got 400 students and it's a compulsory course, and you have CPT 431, which is an elective with 100 course. Both of these are commercial courses, but the other one is based on economics, while the other one is based on the procedure of the law. So these require different techniques that students must learn, and we had to reflect upon the mechanisms that we could use to assess the students so that they can be able to reflect within their work. Next slide, please. So at this particular point in time that we had to start teaching from home, Competition Law 431 already had one written assessment, which was a written test, and there were two outstanding assessments. So we had to think what would be the appropriate ways of testing students within these particular formative assessments that were left within the particular course. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so what I decided to then do was that in the first assessment, the students would have an online test. So in this particular online test, this would allow for the students to be able to complete the test fully online without having to do anything extra outside of the test. Can you go on to the next slide, please? So this was done using the iCanva test and quizzes option. So the test was uploaded on iCanva and students would have to take the particular test at a particular point in time. So the test would be open throughout the day, and once the student logs in, they had a particular point in time in which they had to complete the test. Can you move on to the next slide? So within this assessment, so what I then decided to do was that I had a range of ways of testing them within this online test. The first was to use true and false questions. So within the law, that allows them for you to see whether or not students can determine what's wrong or what's right within the context of a particular legal scenario. Then I also used normal MCQ questions. So these allow the students to think outside the box and be able to check and understand whether they really understand the work by having to plow through similar answers and determine which answers are correct. But what I also included was a number of MCQ questions based out of scenario questions. Can you move on to the next slide? Can you move on to the next slide, please? So if you are looking at this particular scenario that was in the assessment in the previous slide, one can see that it's a scenario question where students must think around a scenario of price fixing by the banks. So if banks are involved in a price fixing scandal in determining the price of the rand, what must happen and what type of anti-competitive practices are there? So they have a number of questions based on that particular question that they must reflect upon. In the third assessment, I opted to using an oral assessment. So in this particular oral assessment, students had two options. They could use the Zoom platform or they could use the WhatsApp call. So in this particular option, this allowed students that may not necessarily do well in an online test to actually engage with me critically on the work and showcase their understanding of the particular course and receive a mark in line with that particular participation. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so I then use the meeting app on a Canva for students to be able to schedule assessments. So a number of slots are scheduled, and then students would then place their availability on this particular schedule, and then they can select what time they want to do their particular oral assessment. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, another thing that I also used was informal formative assessment. So in this particular instance, I gave students a number of tasks to prepare them for the exam. So at this particular stage in time, I could already realize that the manner in which the course had been taught so far may not exactly link with how the exam would be structured. So I started to prepare them for the possibility that the exam that we would have could be a take-home assessment. Can you go on to the next slide? And then in terms of assessment preparation, the material was loaded on as chapters on a Canva, and students could then access the materials. So voice clips would be uploaded and they could download. Each clip would be a maximum of 15 minutes so that it's easy to download. Can you move on to the next 2 slides, please? Okay, and then the final assessment was a take-home assessment. So this would allow for the students to not really rush into their assessment, but actually take their time and reflect and engage with the work. Can you go on to the next slide, please? So in this final assessment, what I used 2 types of questions to be able to challenge the students. So the first one was a research question. Can you move on to the next slide? So in terms of the research question, students would be able to get a particular question and actually research into what they believed would be a good answer in that particular legal scenario. After that, students were also tested on a case study. So with the case study, they were given a practical example of a COVID-19 scenario. This revolved around the situation of EdCon and how it needed to go into business rescue. So students had to reflect on this and see how this affected the various competition laws and what anti-competitive issues could actually arise out of this situation regarding EdCon. Can you move on to the next slide? So once students were done, they could submit their assessments onto the assignment tab on Canva, and then I would then be able to grade the assessments on Canva. Can you move on to the next slide? Then with Insolvency Law 311, we had to use a similar but differentiated approach. So for the tutorials, they were all conducted online, and one of the tests was also done online. Can you move on to the next slide? But what we also did differently in this particular course is we saw the need for actually also having an assignment. So we introduced an assignment in this particular case. So to allow students not to copy each other, but to also engage with the material, what we did is the assignment was based on a particular case that is very popular in the law, which is Axon versus Lane, which is a big constitutional and insolvency law case. So students had to rethink this particular case in groups and come up with their own judgment. So this entailed that every single particular group had to have a different answer because it was their own judgment. So this allowed students to be able to engage with the work and reflect upon what they'd learned so far within the particular course. Can you move on to the next assessment? Next slide.
You have 1 minute.
Okay. Once again, they had to submit this work on Canva, and we then used a range of questions to test them. So we had MCQ questions drawn out of a pool of 70. We had matching type questions where students could be able to match scenarios to particular concepts with short essay questions. where they could display what they understood from the particular materials. And they also had a scenario question where they had to show their understanding of the work. So what was the outcome of this particular method of testing? So what we were able to do is we were able to get students to reflect on the particular material and be able to demonstrate skills that are in line with their graduate attributes, so that after they graduate, they can be able to enter into the field of practice and be able to showcase these particular skills that they've learned throughout these particular courses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tinashe, and really great work. We clearly see the alignment of you thinking about your assessment and to the graduate attributes, and so much effort to prepare your students for the final assessment. Thank you. I'm sure there'll be lots of people contacting you in your law faculty that should learn from some of these assessment types. Thank you so much.